Hi, my name is Zara. 3 months ago, my sister didn't just dismiss my dreams, she weaponized my love for family against me. She turned my culinary passion into a punchline, my ambitions into inconvenience, and my talents into her personal convenience store. When she demanded I drop everything to watch her kids during the most important night of my career, she thought she was keeping me in my place. But the thing about true talent is that it finds a way to shine, even from the shadows of someone else's selfishness. Tonight, I'm not just a line cook anymore. I'm the chef who turned a babysitting nightmare into a Michelin-starred dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windows of my Pearl District loft like an impatient dinner rush, each drop carrying the weight of another exhausting day at Midtown Grill. I kicked off my non-slip shoes, letting them thud against the hardwood floor, and peeled off my chef's coat that still reeked of fryer oil and disappointment. The apartment was small but mine, every inch paid for by 16-hour shifts and burns that had become permanent constellations across my forearms. I dropped my knife roll onto the kitchen counter and noticed my phone buzzing with the persistence of a smoke alarm. 7 missed calls from Victoria. My stomach clenched with the familiar dread that came with my sister's urgency. Victoria never called unless she needed something, and she never needed small things. The phone rang again, her contact photo flashing on the screen. Victoria at her wedding 3 years ago, radiant in designer white. Her smile perfectly practiced for the cameras. I let it ring twice more before answering, already knowing this conversation would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. Zara, thank God. Victoria's voice cut through the speaker with the sharpness of a paring knife. I need you to watch Leo and Mia tomorrow night. It's Nathan's and my anniversary, and we have reservations at Le Bernardin in Seattle. The babysitter just canceled and you're literally the only person I trust with the kids. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, watching my own expression shift from exhaustion to disbelief. Tomorrow night wasn't just any night. Tomorrow night was the Portland Culinary Institute's annual scholarship gala, where 20 emerging chefs would compete for a chance to stage at Le Jardin Noir under Chef Antoine Rousseau. I had been preparing for months, perfecting a dish that represented everything I'd learned from our grandmother Celeste, everything I'd sacrificed working in mediocre kitchens while dreaming of something greater. Victoria, I can't. Tomorrow night, I have the culinary competition at PC. I've been preparing for months. And oh, come on, Zara. It's just a little cooking contest. Nathan and I haven't had a real date night in months, and this dinner cost us $800. The kids adore you, and it's not like you're actually doing anything important. The words hit like ice water down my spine. Not doing anything important. 5 years of culinary school debt. 3 years of working in kitchens where I was the only woman who wasn't serving drinks. Countless nights practicing knife work until my fingers bled, all reduced to a hobby that could be postponed for my sister's convenience. This isn't just a cooking contest, Victoria. This is a scholarship competition that could change my entire career. If I win, I get to work with Chef Rousseau at Le Jardin Noir. Do you understand what that means? The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear the television in the background, some reality show where people screamed at each other for entertainment. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected since childhood, the one that made disagreement feel like betrayal. I understand that you're being incredibly selfish right now. Family comes first, Zara. Always. And frankly, I'm tired of pretending that your little chef fantasy is going to amount to anything. You're 28 years old, working at a chain restaurant, and living in a studio apartment. Meanwhile, Nathan and I are building something real. We have responsibilities, commitments that actually matter. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar ache that came with Victoria's special brand of motivation. She had always been the golden daughter, the one who followed the approved path from law school to marriage, to the West Hills mansion that our parents toured like a shrine. I was the one who chose passion over security, art over stability, dreams over the safe harbor of familial expectation. Victoria, please, this competition could be my break. I've been working toward this for years, And I've been planning this anniversary dinner for months. The kids will be asleep by 8. All you have to do is sit in my house and watch Netflix. It's not like you have anything better to do on a Saturday night anyway. The casual cruelty of that last comment settled into my chest like a splinter. Victoria had always possessed an uncanny ability to locate the exact pressure point that would make me question everything I thought I knew about my own work. She knew that my Saturday nights were usually spent alone, perfecting recipes or reading cookbooks, while she attended charity galas and dinner parties where people discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes. "I'll pay you $200, she continued, as if my dreams were a service that could be purchased. "That's more than you make in a whole shift at that place." $200. It was more than I made in a shift. More than I had in my checking account after rent and groceries and the monthly payment on my knife set. It was also a fraction of what Victoria spent on a single brunch with her book club friends, women who treated culinary school like an expensive hobby rather than a career path. I found myself staring at the stack of cookbooks on my coffee table, their spines worn from countless reading. At the top sat Letters to a Young Chef, by Daniel Bulloud, a gift from grandmother Celeste before she passed 2 years ago. She had inscribed it with shaking handwriting that still made my throat tight. "For Zara, who cooks with her heart and dreams with her soul. Never let anyone convince you that feeding people isn't sacred work." "I need an answer, Zara. Nathan is waiting in the car, and we need to confirm our hotel reservation." The rain outside had softened to a steady whisper, and I could smell the faint aroma of garlic and herbs drifting up from the Italian restaurant below my apartment. Somewhere in this city, Chef Rousseau was probably reviewing applications for the competition, deciding which young cooks deserved a chance to learn from one of the most innovative chefs in the Pacific Northwest. Somewhere dreams were being evaluated and futures were being determined, while I stood in my tiny kitchen debating whether my ambitions were worth disappointing my sister. "Fine," I heard myself say, the word escaping before I could call it back. "I'll watch the kids. You're the best. I knew I could count on you. We'll drop them off around 5 tomorrow, and we should be home by midnight at the latest." "You're saving our marriage, I swear." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of rain and the hollow ache of a choice I already regret. I sank into my second-hand armchair and pulled out my phone to call Camille, the only person who understood the weight of what I'd just given up. Camille Rodriguez had been my partner through every disaster of culinary school, from food poisoning incidents to knife cuts that required stitches. She was currently working as a sous chef at a farm-to-table restaurant in the Alberta Arts District, and she possessed the rare gift of being able to talk me through panic attacks with the same precision she used to brunoise vegetable. "Please tell me you're calling to practice your presentation for tomorrow night," Camille said by way of greeting, her voice warm with the kind of encouragement I desperately needed. "I'm calling to tell you that I just ruined my life," I said. And then I told her everything. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either wisdom or fury. With Camille, it was usually both. "Zara Elena Delacroix," she said finally, using my full name the way our pastry chef instructor used to when we'd over-seasoned a sauce. "Tell me you did not just agree to babysit during the most important culinary competition of your career because your sister asked nicely." "She didn't ask nice," she demanded. And then she insulted my entire life until I felt guilty for having ambitions that interfered with her anniversary dinner. "And you said yes because you're a good person with terrible boundaries who has been programmed since birth to believe that your dreams are less important than everyone else's convenience." This was why I loved Camille. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to cut through emotional manipulation and identify the psychological mechanics at work. She had grown up in a family of 5 kids where resources were scarce but support was abundant. The opposite of my experience with endless resources and conditional love. "What am I supposed to do, Cam?" I already said yes. "She's probably already told Nathan and they've probably already confirmed their hotel reservation. If I back out now, I'm the selfish sister who ruined their anniversary. And if you don't back out, you're the sister who sacrificed her career for someone who doesn't respect." "Zara, this isn't just about tomorrow night. This is about whether you're going to spend the rest of your life letting Victoria use your kindness against you." I knew she was right. I had always known she was right, but knowing and acting were separated by years of conditioning that made disappointing Victoria feel like moral failure. My sister had perfected the art of making her needs feel like emergencies and my needs feel like indulgence. Maybe there's another competition, maybe Chef Rousseau will do this again next year. Maybe you'll wake up tomorrow and realize that you're 28 years old and you don't need permission from anyone to prioritize your own life. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, surrounded by the tools and dreams that defined my world. My knife roll lay open on the counter, revealing the German steel that had cost me 3 months of grocery money, but cut through anything with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. On the refrigerator beneath a magnet shaped like a whisk was the acceptance letter for tomorrow's competition, printed on heavy cardstock that made it feel official and important. I thought about grandmother Celeste, who had taught me to cook in her Hawthorne District cottage during the summers when my parents decided I needed structure and Victoria needed space to focus on academics. Grandmère had emigrated from Lyon with nothing but her recipes and an unshakable belief that food was the language of love. She had built a small catering business from her home kitchen, feeding Portland's French community with dishes that transported them back to a homeland they missed with every bite. She used to tell me that cooking was like painting, but instead of colors we worked with flavors and textures and temperature. She taught me that a properly made sauce could tell the story of a place, that bread baked with patience and respect could connect strangers across cultures and generations. Most importantly, she taught me that cooking for people was not just a job but a calling, a way of caring for the world that required both technical skill and emotional generosity. When she died, she left me her recipe collection, handwritten in a mixture of French and English that chronicled decades of innovation and tradition. She also left me her chef's knife, a carbon steel blade that had been her grandmother's, its edge honed by generations of women who understood that feeding people was sacred work. Victoria had inherited grandmère's jewelry and furniture, items that could be appraised and displayed and used to signal sophistication at dinner parties. I had inherited her passion and her recipes, things that couldn't be quantified but had shaped every decision I'd made since her funeral. The next morning, I woke to gray Pacific Northwest light filtering through my blinds and the immediate memory of what I'd given up. My phone showed 3 text messages from Camille, each one a variation of "It's not too late to change your mind," and one from Victoria confirming the evening's logistics with the casual efficiency of someone who had never doubted that her needs would be accommodated. I spent the morning at the farmers market in the Pearl District, a ritual that usually brought me peace but today felt like attending my own funeral. I walked past vendors selling perfect spring vegetables, artisanal cheeses and bread that still radiated warmth from the oven. These were the ingredients I would have used for my competition dish, a modern interpretation of grandmère's coq au vin that honored tradition while showcasing technique I'd developed over years of practice. The dish was perfect. I knew it was perfect. I had practiced it dozens of times, adjusting the acid balance, perfecting the sauce consistency, finding the exact temperature that would render the chicken skin crispy while keeping the meat succulent. It was a dish that told my story, connecting my French heritage with my American training, honoring my grandmother while proving my own innovation. Instead of shopping for those ingredients, I found myself buying coloring books and juice boxes for Leo and Mia, children I loved but who reminded me of everything I wasn't accomplishing in my own life. At 8 and 5, they already had more stability and opportunity than I'd managed to create for myself. By 5 o'clock, I was standing in the marble foyer of Victoria's West Hills mansion, my overnight bag feeling heavier than my knife roll. The house was everything my apartment wasn't: spacious, elegant, designed to impress rather than simply shelter. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, and the lighting had been professionally installed to flatter everyone who passed beneath. Victoria appeared at the top of the curved staircase like a movie star making an entrance. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her hair had been styled into the kind of effortless waves that required 2 hours and a professional. She looked beautiful, confident, untouchable in the way that came with never having to choose between dreams and security. "Zara, you're a lifesaver," she said, floating down the stairs with the grace of someone who had never worked a double shift in uncomfortable shoes. "The kids are so excited to spend time with their favorite aunt. Leo wants to show you his new Lego set, and Mia has been talking about making cookies all day." I I smiled and hugged the children who rushed toward me with the uncomplicated affection that made babysitting them both a joy and a reminder of what I was missing. Leo had grown taller since I'd last seen him, all legs and elbows and questions about everything. Mia still smelled like strawberry shampoo and possessed the kind of confidence that came with being 5 years old and absolutely certain that the world existed for her entertainment. Nathan appeared behind Victoria, adjusting his tie with the practiced ease of someone who attended formal dinners regularly. He was handsome in the way that successful men often were, well-groomed and well-dressed, and completely comfortable in spaces where his presence was expected and welcome. "Thanks for doing this, Zara," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "Victoria's been looking forward to this dinner for months. The chef at Le Barnardien is supposed to be incredible." I nodded and smiled and said all the appropriate things about having a wonderful time and not worrying about anything. I kissed the children goodbye and watched my sister's perfect life disappear into the Seattle twilight, leaving me alone with 2 beautiful kids and the crushing weight of what I'd sacrificed for this moment. The evening passed pleasantly enough. We built elaborate Lego structures, watched animated movies that were far more sophisticated than anything I remembered from childhood, and ate pizza that Victoria had pre-ordered from an organic restaurant that delivered to West Hill. Leo told me about his soccer team and his favorite video games, while Mia demonstrated her ability to braid her own hair and explained the complex social dynamics of kindergarten. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By 8:30, both children were asleep, exhausted by the kind of day that only happens when school-age energy meets weekend freedom. I tucked them into beds that were larger than my entire sleeping area, kissed their foreheads, and crept downstairs to the living room, where Victoria's enormous television offered hundreds of channels of distraction. Instead of watching anything, I found myself in Victoria's kitchen, a space designed more for impressing guests than for actual cooking. The appliances were top of the line, the kind of equipment I dreamed about but could never afford. The refrigerator was larger than my closet, and the gas range featured 6 burners and a griddle that could have accommodated a small restaurant's worth of orders. I opened Victoria's spice cabinet and found neat rows of containers that had clearly been purchased for display rather than use. Most of the spices were full, their expiration dates suggesting they'd been sitting unopened for months. It was a kitchen designed by someone who thought of cooking as a chore rather than an art, a necessity rather than a passion. At 9:15, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a telemarketer or wrong number. Something made me answer, perhaps the same instinct that had taught me when oil was hot enough for frying or when bread had proofed to perfect readiness. "Is this Zara Delacroix?" The voice was accented, French but softened by years of speaking English. It was also familiar in a way that made my heart stop. "Yes, this is Zara. This is Chef Antoine Rousseau from Le Jardin Noir. I understand you were registered for tonight's competition at Portland Culinary Institute, but you haven't arrived. I wanted to call personally because your application showed exceptional promise, and I was very much looking forward to tasting your interpretation of Coco." Chef Antoine Rousseau, the chef whose cookbook had inspired me to apply to culinary school, whose techniques I had studied like gospel, whose restaurant represented everything I aspired to achieve, was calling me personally to ask why I hadn't shown up to a competition I'd dreamed about for months. "Chef Rousseau, I'm so sorry. I had a family emergency and I couldn't make it tonight. I know how important this opportunity was, and I'm devastated that I had to miss it." There was a pause, during which I could hear the faint sounds of kitchen activity in the background. Somewhere, talented young chefs were presenting their dishes to one of the most respected culinary minds in the Pacific Northwest, while I sat in my sister's showcase kitchen, explaining why I'd chosen family obligation over professional opportunity. "Family emergencies, I understand completely," Chef Rousseau said, his voice gentle with the kind of empathy that came from understanding the weight of difficult choices. "But perhaps you could tell me about your dish. I read your application essay about your grandmother's influence on your cooking, and it reminded me very much of my own journey from land to Portland. For the next 20 minutes, I found myself describing my dish to Chef Rousseau as if I were presenting it in person. I explained how I'd modified Grandmare's traditional recipe, incorporating Pacific Northwest ingredients like local mushrooms and Oregon Pinot Noir. I described the technique I'd developed for achieving perfect skin texture, the sauce reduction that balanced acidity and richness, the garnish that honored tradition while showcasing innovation. As I spoke, I could hear the sounds of Victoria's neighborhood settling into Saturday night quiet. Somewhere in Seattle, my sister was enjoying a dinner that cost more than I earned in a week, completely unaware that the person babysitting her children was having the most important conversation of her culinary career while sitting in a kitchen filled with unused tools and expired spices. "Your passion is evident," Chef Rousseau said when I finished describing the dish, "and your understanding of technique is impressive. Would you be willing to prepare this dish for me next week? Not as part of a competition, but as a personal audition. I am opening a second location of Le Jardin Noir, and I'm looking for a sous chef who understands both tradition and innovation." I stared at Victoria's pristine refrigerator, my reflection wavering in its stainless steel surface. The woman looking back at me had spent years compromising her dreams for other people's convenience, accepting that her ambitions were less important than everyone else's comfort. But she was also someone who had just described a dish with the kind of passion that made a Michelin-starred chef call personally to offer an audition. "I would be honored to cook for you, Chef Rousseau." "Excellent. Can you come to Le Jardin Noir this Tuesday at 2 o'clock? Bring your knives and your grandmother's recipe. I want to taste the dish that made you a chef." After we hung up, I sat in Victoria's perfect kitchen for a long time, processing what had just happened. Chef Rousseau had called me. He had read my application, remembered my essay, taken time during his own competition to reach out to someone who hadn't even shown up. More importantly, he had offered me exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been dreaming about since I'd first stepped into a professional kitchen. I thought about calling Camille, but it was past 10 o'clock, and she was probably working the Saturday night dinner rush at her restaurant. I thought about texting Victoria, but she was in the middle of her anniversary dinner, and this news would only remind her that I'd had somewhere important to be tonight. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. I needed to document this moment, to capture the feeling of possibility that was expanding in my chest like bread rising in a warm oven. Someday, when I was working in my own kitchen or teaching young cooks or writing my own cookbook, I wanted to remember the night when everything changed because I answered a phone call I almost ignored. "This is Zara Delacroix," I said into the phone, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "It's Saturday, March 15th, and I just got off the phone with Chef Antoine Rousseau. I'm sitting in my sister's kitchen, babysitting her children while she enjoys an anniversary dinner in Seattle, and I just got offered an audition at Le Jardin Noir. I missed the competition tonight because I thought family obligations were more important than my dream. But maybe, just maybe, the universe has a different plan." I saved the memo and slipped my phone back into my pocket. Upstairs, Leo and Mia slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that their babysitter had just received the call that would change everything. In Seattle, Victoria was probably ordering dessert, satisfied that her anniversary dinner was proceeding exactly as planned. And in Portland, a young chef sat in a borrowed kitchen, finally understanding that some dreams are too important to postpone for anyone else's convenience. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anticipation and planning. I researched Chef Rousseau's background, studied his techniques, read every interview he'd given about his philosophy of cooking. I made lists of ingredients I would need for Tuesday's audition, calculated costs, and began mentally preparing for the most important meal I would ever cook. When Victoria and Nathan returned home just after midnight, glowing with wine and satisfaction, I hugged them goodbye and accepted Victoria's effusive thanks for saving their marriage with my babysitting service. I smiled and nodded and said all the appropriate things about having a lovely evening with the children. What I didn't tell her was that while she was enjoying her $800 dinner, I had received something far more valuable: validation that my dreams were worth pursuing, proof that talent recognized talent, and confirmation that some opportunities arrive exactly when we need them most, even when we're not where we thought we should be. As I drove home through the empty Portland streets, past restaurants closing their kitchens and bars preparing for last call, I thought about Grandmère and the recipes she'd left me. I thought about the years of doubt and compromise, the countless times I'd let other people's expectations override my own instincts. Most importantly, I thought about Tuesday afternoon and the chance to cook for someone who understood that feeding people was indeed sacred work. The rain had stopped, and the city sparkled with possibility under the streetlights. In 3 days I would walk into Le Jardin Noir with my knives and my grandmother's recipe and the accumulated wisdom of every kitchen I'd ever worked in. I would cook the dish that told my story, honoring tradition while proving innovation, showing Chef Rousseau exactly why he'd taken the time to call a chef who hadn't even shown up to his competition. But first I needed to get some sleep, because Tuesday was going to be the most important day of my culinary career, and I intended to be ready for it. The following Monday arrived with the kind of drizzle that made Portland feel like it was wrapped in gauze, soft and muted and perfect for introspection. I had called in sick to Midtown Grill, something I'd never done without actually being ill, but the lie felt necessary. I needed time to prepare, to practice, to transform my grandmother's recipe into something worthy of Chef Rousseau's attention. My tiny apartment had been converted into a test kitchen, every surface covered with ingredients, notebooks, and variations of the dish I'd been perfecting for months. The coq au vin had evolved beyond Grandmère's original recipe, incorporating techniques I'd learned in culinary school and innovations I'd discovered through years of experimentation. But it still carried her essence, the soul of a woman who understood that cooking was about more than feeding bodies. I spent the morning at Portland's most exclusive specialty food stores, places where ingredients cost more per pound than I usually spent on groceries in a week. The wine alone for the dish cost $60, a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir that would complement the richness of the chicken while adding the kind of depth that separated restaurant cooking from home cooking. I bought pearl onions that were perfectly uniform, bacon from heritage pigs that had been raised on specific diets, mushrooms that had been foraged from old-growth forests in the Cascade Mountains. Each ingredient represented an investment I couldn't afford to make carelessly. If this audition failed, I would be eating ramen and rice for the next month, but the alternative was presenting Chef Rousseau with anything less than perfection. This was my one chance to prove that I belonged in his kitchen, that my dreams were worth the risks I'd taken to pursue them. Camille arrived at my apartment around noon, carrying her own knife roll and a bottle of champagne she'd been saving for a special occasion. She had taken the afternoon off from her restaurant to help me practice, a gesture of friendship that reminded me why I'd survived culinary school with my sanity intact. "Show me what you've got," she said, settling onto my couch with the focus of a judge at a cooking competition. "And don't hold back. I want to see the dish that made a Michelin-starred chef call you personally." For the next 3 hours I cooked the same dish 4 times, adjusting seasoning, refining technique, perfecting time. Camille tasted each iteration with the critical palate of a professional, offering suggestions that sharpened flavors and improved presentation. She had an extraordinary ability to identify the precise moment when a sauce reached perfect consistency, when proteins achieved optimal texture, when garnishes enhanced rather than distracted from the primary element. "The third version," she said finally, after we'd eaten enough coq au vin to feed a small dinner party, "the sauce has the right balance of wine and stock, the chicken skin is perfect, and the pearl onions aren't overcooked. But add a touch more time next time, and consider finishing with a whisper of cream, not enough to make it heavy, just enough to give it silkiness." I made notes in the margins of Grandmère's original recipe, my handwriting joining hers in a conversation that spanned generations. She had written in careful cursive that reflected her convent education in Lyon, while my notes were hurried and practical, filled with abbreviations and temperatures and timing reminders. Together they told the story of a recipe that had evolved while maintaining its essential character. "Are you nervous?" Camille asked as we cleaned up the kitchen, washing dishes that had been used to create what might be the most important meal of my career. "Terrified," I admitted. "This isn't just about the job, This is about proving to myself that I made the right choice when I chose cooking over everything else my family wanted for me. If I fail tomorrow, it's not just a missed opportunity, it's confirmation that Victoria was right when she said my dreams were unrealistic. Camille dried a mixing bowl with the methodical precision she brought to everything, her movements economical and practical. She had worked in enough kitchens to understand the weight of moments like these, when years of preparation condensed into a single performance that would determine the trajectory of a career. "You know what the difference is between you and Victoria," she said, hanging the towel on its designated hook. "She's built her entire life around other people's definitions of success. Law degree because that's what successful people study, marriage to Nathan, because that's what successful women do, house in West Hills because that's where successful families live. She's never had to risk anything because she's never wanted anything that wasn't already approved by society." I nodded, understanding the truth of what she was saying. Victoria had followed a script that guaranteed certain outcomes: financial security, social status, family approval. It was a safe path, a sensible path, a path that had led to genuine happiness and stability. But it was also a path that required surrendering any dreams that didn't align with conventional expectations. "You chose the harder road," Camille continued. "You chose to pursue something you love even though it meant financial uncertainty, family disapproval, and years of physical exhaustion. That choice took courage that Victoria has never had to develop. Tomorrow you're not just cooking for Chef Rousseau, you're cooking for every person who has ever been told that their dreams are impractical." That evening, I called my parents for the first time in several weeks, a conversation I'd been avoiding because I knew it would include questions about my career progress and subtle suggestions about more stable alternatives. Patricia and Robert Delacroix were good people who loved their daughters but understood only one definition of success, the definition that Victoria had embraced and I had rejected. "Zara, sweetheart." My mother's voice carried the warmth that had comforted me through childhood nightmares and adolescent heartbreaks. "We haven't heard from you in ages. How are things at the restaurant?" I told them about the audition, editing the story to focus on the opportunity rather than the circumstances that had led to it. I mentioned Chef Rousseau's reputation, the potential for career advancement, the chance to work in one of Portland's most respected kitchens. What I didn't mention was that this opportunity existed because I'd chosen to babysit instead of attending a competition, or that my sister had dismissed my dreams as a little chef fantasy. "That sounds wonderful, dear," my father said, his voice carrying the careful enthusiasm parents used when they didn't quite understand their children's choices but wanted to be supportive. "Will this job pay better than your current position?" The question stung because it reduced everything I'd worked for to a simple matter of compensation, but I knew it came from genuine concern. My parents had immigrated from modest circumstances and built comfortable lives through careful planning and conservative choice. They worried about my financial stability because they remembered what it felt like to struggle and they wanted better for their daughters. "It's not just about money, Dad. This is about working with one of the most innovative chefs in the region, learning techniques that will advance my career, being part of a team that creates extraordinary food. Of course, sweetheart. We just want you to be happy and secure." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the tools and ingredients of my chosen profession, feeling the familiar isolation that came with pursuing dreams that no one in my family quite understood. They loved me, but they loved the idea of me settling down, finding stability, choosing security over passion. They couldn't comprehend why I would sacrifice comfort for the chance to spend my life doing work that exhausted my body but fed my soul. I thought about calling Victoria to tell her about the audition, but I knew the conversation would follow a predictable pattern. She would express polite interest while making subtle comments about the instability of restaurant work, the physical demands of kitchen labor, the limited opportunities for advancement in a field dominated by ego and temperament. She would wish me luck while making it clear that she considered my choices fundamentally misguided. Instead, I spent the evening reading interviews with Chef Rousseau, studying his philosophy of cooking, understanding the principles that guided his approach to food. He spoke about cuisine as a form of storytelling, each dish a narrative that connected diners to ingredients, techniques, and cultural tradition. He believed that restaurants were community spaces where people gathered to celebrate life's important moments, and that chefs bore the responsibility of creating experiences that honored those occasions. His words resonated with everything Grandmère had taught me about the sacred nature of feeding people. Food was never just sustenance, it was comfort, celebration, connection, memory. A perfectly prepared meal could transport diners to childhood kitchens, distant countries, moments of profound happiness. This was why I cooked, not for money or recognition, but for the chance to create those moments of connection and joy. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual sunshine, as if Portland had decided to cooperate with the most important day of my career. I woke early and began the ritual of preparation that had become second nature after years of professional cooking. Shower, coffee, meditation over my knife roll to ensure every blade was properly sharpened and positioned. I dressed carefully, choosing the professional chef's attire that would signal my seriousness while allowing for the physical demands of cooking. Black pants that wouldn't show stains, non-slip shoes that would provide stability during long hours on my feet, a clean white chef's coat that represented both tradition and personal pride. Around my neck, I wore the small silver chain that had belonged to Grandmère, a talisman that carried her blessing into every kitchen I entered. The drive to Le Jardin Noir took me through neighborhoods that showcased Portland's evolution from industrial port city to culinary destination. I passed food trucks that served innovative fusion cuisine, bakeries that specialized in artisanal breads, markets that sourced ingredients from local farms and producers. This was the ecosystem that had nurtured my dreams, a community of people who understood that food was art, commerce, and cultural expression simultaneously. Le Jardin Noir occupied a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, its exterior understated in the way that truly confident establishments could afford to be. No flashy signage or desperate attempts to attract attention, just simple lettering on glass doors that opened into a space designed for serious dining. The interior was elegant without being pretentious, comfortable without being casual, sophisticated without being intimidating. I entered through the service entrance as instructed, carrying my knife roll and a small cooler containing the ingredients I'd selected for the audition. The kitchen was everything I'd expected from a restaurant of this caliber: immaculate, organized, equipped with professional-grade tools that represented the difference between cooking as hobby and cooking as craft. Chef Rousseau appeared within moments of my arrival, a man whose presence filled the kitchen without dominating it. He was shorter than I'd expected but possessed the kind of confident energy that came from decades of commanding respect through skill rather than intimidation. His chef's coat was spotless, his movements economical, his attention completely focused on the task at hand. "Mademoiselle Delacroix," he said, his accent lending formality to the greeting. "Welcome to Le Jardin Noir. I trust you've brought everything you need to show me this dish that made you a chef." I unpacked my ingredients on the prep station he'd designated, arranging them with the care of a painter setting up a palette. The heritage bacon, the organic pearl onions, the wild mushrooms, the carefully selected wine, each component represented hours of research and consideration. Choices made not just for flavor but for the story they would tell about my understanding of technique and tradition. "Before you begin cooking," Chef Rousseau said, "tell me about your grandmother. Your application essay mentioned her influence, but I want to understand how she shaped your approach to cuisine." For the next 20 minutes, I found myself describing Grandmère's kitchen, her techniques, her philosophy of cooking as an act of love. I explained how she had taught me to taste constantly, to adjust seasoning throughout the cooking process, rather than hoping for the best at the end. I described her patience with failures, her insistence that mistakes were learning opportunities rather than defeats, her belief that cooking was a craft that required both technical skill and emotional intelligence. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Chef Rousseau said when I finished, "and she would be proud to see you here today, preparing to cook for someone who shares her respect for tradition and innovation. Please, begin whenever you're ready." The cooking process unfolded with the rhythm I'd practiced dozens of times, each step performed with the muscle memory that came from years of repetition. I rendered the bacon slowly, building layers of flavor that would permeate the entire dish. I seasoned the chicken pieces thoughtfully, browning them to develop the deep color that would signal proper technique to anyone who understood the fundamentals of braising. As I worked, Chef Rousseau moved around the kitchen observing my technique without interfering, asking occasional questions about my choices. Why did I choose to flame the cognac at this particular moment? How did I determine the proper temperature for searing the protein? What visual cues told me when the vegetables had reached optimal caramelization? His questions revealed the depth of his own knowledge while testing mine, confirming that technique was more than following instructions, but understanding the science and artistry that made each step necessary. I answered confidently, explaining the reasoning behind every decision, demonstrating that I understood not just what to do but why each action contributed to the final result. The braising liquid came together like a symphony reaching crescendo, the wine and stock combining with aromatics to create something greater than the sum of its parts. I tasted constantly, adjusting seasoning with the precision grandmère had drilled into me, understanding that great cooking happened in the small adjustments that transformed good dishes into memorable ones. Your technique is very clean, Chef Rousseau observed as I carefully strained the braising liquid before returning it to the pot. You understand the importance of building flavors gradually, rather than hoping that time will solve problems that should be addressed during the cooking process. While the dish finished braising, we talked about my experience in restaurant kitchens, my aspirations for continued learning, my understanding of the demands that came with working in a kitchen that served discerning diners who expected excellence with every plate. I spoke honestly about the physical challenges of professional cooking, the long hours and intense pressure that separated those who cooked for love from those who cooked for survival. Cooking professionally is not romantic, he said, watching me prepare the final garnish with the attention to detail that separated restaurant plating from home presentation. It is demanding work that requires physical stamina, emotional resilience, and the ability to perform consistently under pressure. Many people who love cooking discover that they do not love cooking professionally. I understood what he was telling me. Kitchen work was brutal, unforgiving, exhausting in ways that people outside the industry couldn't comprehend. It required sacrificing evenings and weekends, enduring burns and cuts and the constant ache of standing for 12 hours, accepting that perfection was expected rather than celebrated. It was work that destroyed relationships, tested physical limits, and offered no guarantees of financial success. I've been working in kitchens for 6 years, I said, carefully arranging the final elements of the dish on the plate Chef Rousseau had provided. I understand the demands, and I've never wanted to do anything else. This isn't a career I'm trying on to see if it fits. This is who I am. The finished plate looked exactly as I'd envisioned it, the chicken glistening with perfectly reduced sauce, the vegetables arranged to showcase their individual colors and textures, the garnish adding visual interest without overwhelming the classical presentation. It was a dish that honored tradition while demonstrating technical competence, showing respect for grandmère's legacy while proving my own understanding of contemporary cooking standards. Chef Rousseau examined the plate with the critical eye of someone who had evaluated thousands of dishes, noting details of color, composition and presentation before lifting the fork for his first taste. The kitchen fell silent, except for the distant sounds of prep work happening in other areas of the restaurant, the normal rhythm of service preparation continuing while my future hung in the balance of a single bite. He chewed thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing while he evaluated flavors, textures, seasoning, technique. He took a second bite, then a third, tasting different elements of the dish to understand how they worked together to create the complete experience. Finally, he set down his fork and looked directly at me. "This is exceptional work," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinion could change careers. "The flavors are perfectly balanced, the technique is flawless, and the presentation honors both tradition and innovation. Most importantly, this dish tells a story. I can taste your grandmother's influence, but I can also taste your own development as a cook. This is not imitation but interpretation, which is the mark of a chef rather than someone who simply follows recipes." Relief flooded through me like warm honey, followed immediately by excitement that made my hands tremble slightly. Chef Rousseau liked the dish. More than liked it, he understood it, appreciated both its technical execution and its emotional resonance. This was the validation I'd been seeking for years, confirmation that my skills were worthy of respect in kitchens where excellence was the minimum standard. "I would like to offer you a position as sous chef in my new restaurant," he continued. "The salary will be significantly more than you're currently earning, and you'll have opportunities to develop your own dishes while learning techniques that will advance your career. But I want you to understand that this kitchen operates at a level that will challenge everything you think you know about cooking professionally. The offer was everything I'd dreamed of and more than I'd dared to hope for. Sous chef at a restaurant that would undoubtedly earn critical acclaim, working directly with a chef whose techniques were studied by culinary students around the world, developing skills that would position me for executive chef roles in the future. It was the opportunity that justified every sacrifice I'd made, every doubt I'd endured, every moment when I'd questioned whether my dreams were worth pursuing. "I accept," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "When would you like me to 2 weeks from today. That will give you time to provide proper notice at your current position and prepare for the intensity of working here. I'll have my manager send you the employment paperwork and details about our training schedule." As I packed my knives and cleaned my prep station, Chef Rousseau shared details about the new restaurant's concept, his vision for creating a dining experience that honored French technique while celebrating Pacific Northwest ingredients. He spoke about menu development, staff training, the collaborative process that would create dishes worthy of the reputation he'd built over decades of cooking. "One more thing," he said as I prepared to leave. "How did you learn about our scholarship competition? Your application suggested you'd been preparing for months." I explained about the Portland Culinary Institute event, the months of preparation, the difficult choice I'd made to miss the competition for family obligation. I told him about Victoria's anniversary dinner, the babysitting commitment that had seemed more important than my own career aspirations, the way I'd learned to prioritize other people's needs over my own dreams. Chef Rousseau listened without judgment, understanding the complex dynamics that shaped decisions in families where not everyone shared the same values or priorities. When I finished explaining, he nodded thoughtfully. "Family obligations are important," he said, "but so are personal dreams. The challenge is learning when to honor others and when to honor yourself." It sounds like you're beginning to understand that balance. I drove home through Portland traffic that seemed lighter than usual, past restaurants and food trucks and markets that now looked different because I was different. In 2 weeks, I would begin working in a kitchen that represented everything I'd aspired to achieve, learning from a chef whose techniques would expand my capabilities and understand. But first, I needed to have a conversation with Victoria that was years overdue, a discussion about boundaries and respect, and the difference between supporting family and sacrificing dreams. She deserved to know that her little sister's chef fantasy had just become a life-changing reality, and that the babysitting favor she'd demanded had led to the most important opportunity of my career. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor about timing and priorities, and I was finally ready to appreciate the joke. The next morning brought a peculiar sensation, as if I'd been living underwater for years and had suddenly broken through to the surface. Everything looked sharper, colors more vivid, possibilities more tangible. I had 2 weeks to transition from my current life to my new one, 14 days to close one chapter and begin another that would redefine everything I thought I knew about my own potential. My first stop was Midtown Grill, where I needed to deliver my resignation to Marcus, the general manager who had hired me 3 years ago when I was desperate for any kitchen work that would pay rent. The restaurant was already in full prep mode when I arrived, the familiar chaos of morning setup that had once felt overwhelming but now seemed almost quaint compared to what awaited me at Le Jardin Noir. Marcus looked up from his inventory sheets when I knocked on his office door, his expression shifting from routine greeting to concern when he saw my face. He was a decent man who ran a decent restaurant, someone who understood that staff turnover was inevitable in an industry where ambition constantly pulled people toward better opportunities. "Let me guess," he said, setting down his pen with a resigned smile. "Someone finally recognized what I've been telling corporate for months. You're too good for this place." I explained about Chef Rousseau, the audition, the position that represented everything I'd been working toward. Marcus listened without surprise, occasionally nodding as if he'd been expecting this conversation for months. He had watched me practice knife cuts during slow periods, seen me experiment with sauce techniques during prep time, observed the way I approached every task with the intensity of someone who viewed kitchen work as craft rather than employment. "I'm happy for you, Zara. Really. But I'm also terrified about replacing you. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who actually gives a damn about doing things right? Half the line cooks I interview don't even know how to hold a knife properly. We agreed on a transition schedule that would give him time to find a replacement while allowing me to finish my current commitments professionally. I would work through the following weekend, training whoever he hired to take over my station, ensuring that my departure didn't create chaos for the team that had become like family over the past 3 years. The rest of the day was spent in a strange liminal space, performing familiar tasks while mentally preparing for a completely different professional reality. I prepped vegetables with the same precision I'd always used, but now each knife cut felt like practice for more sophisticated work ahead. I seasoned proteins with the same attention to detail, but now I was thinking about flavor profiles that would challenge diners rather than simply satisfy them. During my break, I called Camille to share the news about Chef Rousseau's offer and my conversation with Mark. Her excitement was infectious, the kind of pure joy that came from watching someone you care about achieve something they'd been working toward for years. "I knew it," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated. "I knew that dish was going to change everything for you. When do you start? What's the menu concept? Have you thought about what you're going to wear on your first day?" We talked for 20 minutes about logistics and expectations, the practical details that would shape my transition from line cook to sous chef. Camille had made similar career moves in her own progression through Portland's restaurant scene, and her advice was invaluable for understanding the politics and pressures that came with increased responsibility. "The hardest part won't be the technical demands," she said. "You've got the skills for that. The hardest part will be managing other people's expectations while staying true to your own vision." Sous chef means you're not just cooking anymore. You're leading, teaching, mediating conflicts, and representing the restaurant's standards to everyone who works below you. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a yellow legal pad, making lists of everything that needed to happen before I started my new position. Notice at current job, delivered, professional references, compiled, knife maintenance, scheduled for the weekend, wardrobe upgrade, budgeted despite my precarious finances, mental preparation for working with ingredients I'd only read about, techniques I'd studied but never implemented at scale. But the most daunting item on my list was the conversation I needed to have with Victoria. She deserved to know about my career advancement, but more importantly, I needed to address the pattern of manipulation that had shaped our relationship for decades. Her dismissal of my dreams as unrealistic, her casual assumption that my time was less valuable than hers, her use of family obligation as a weapon to ensure my compliance with her priority. I had been enabling her behavior by consistently choosing peace over principles, avoiding confrontation by accepting that my role in the family was to accommodate everyone else's needs. But something fundamental had shifted during my conversation with Chef Rousseau, a recognition that I possessed value that extended beyond my usefulness to other people. I decided to wait until the weekend to call Victoria, giving myself time to process the magnitude of what had happened and prepare for a conversation that would probably be more difficult than any I'd ever had with my sister. She would not react well to evidence that my chef fantasy had substance, that the dreams she'd dismissed were becoming reality, that the little sister she'd always managed to control was developing independence that threatened her position as the family's success story. Thursday brought my first glimpse into the world I was about to enter, when Chef Rousseau invited me to observe dinner service at Le Jardin Noir. I arrived at 4 o'clock, early enough to witness the transformation that occurred as the restaurant prepared for the evening's guests. The kitchen moved with the precision of a Swiss watch, each person performing their assigned tasks with the efficiency that came from months of working together. I was introduced to the current sous chef, Marie, a woman in her early 30s whose commands carried the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. She welcomed me warmly while making it clear that the standards here were unlike anything I'd experienced in more casual dining establishments. "Every plate that leaves this kitchen represents our reputation," she said, as we watched the pantry cooks prepare garnishes with surgical precision. One poorly seasoned sauce, one overcooked protein, one carelessly plated dish, and we've damaged the trust that took years to build. The pressure is constant, but so is the satisfaction of knowing that you're creating experiences people will remember for years. I spent the evening shadowing different stations, observing techniques that were more sophisticated than anything I'd seen during culinary school. The garde manger station produced salads that looked like abstract art, each component placed with the intentionality of a museum curator. The fish cook handled proteins with the reverence of someone who understood that excellent ingredients deserved excellent preparation. The sauce cook managed multiple reductions simultaneously, adjusting seasoning with the confidence that came from understanding how flavors developed over time. But what impressed me most was the communication between stations. The way information flowed seamlessly to ensure that orders were coordinated and guests received their courses at optimal temperature. This was restaurant work elevated to the level of performance art, where timing was as important as technique and consistency was valued above individual creativity. You'll start on the meat station, Chef Rousseau explained as service wound down around 11 o'clock. Marie will train you on our specific preparations and timing requirements. After you've mastered that, we'll rotate you through other stations until you understand every aspect of our operation. A good sous chef can work any position in the kitchen if necessary. The drive home took me through Portland's late-night landscape, past restaurants closing their kitchens and bars preparing for the final rush of customers seeking conversation and connection. I thought about the cooks finishing their shifts at establishments throughout the city, people who had chosen to spend their lives feeding others despite the physical demands and financial uncertainties that came with professional cooking. Most of them would never work in restaurants like Le Jardin Noir, would never have the opportunity to learn from chefs whose techniques were studied internationally, would never create dishes that challenged diners' expectations while honoring culinary tradition. They were the invisible army that kept Portland's food scene vibrant, talented people who deserved more recognition than they received for work that required genuine skill and dedication. I had been one of them until this week, and I would never forget the grinding exhaustion of working in kitchens where excellence was desired but not always supported by proper training, equipment, or compensation. The opportunity Chef Rousseau had given me was extraordinary, but it was also a responsibility to honor the dreams of everyone who hadn't been as fortunate. Friday morning brought an unexpected text from Victoria, asking if I wanted to join her for lunch at a trendy Pearl District restaurant that had recently opened to considerable fanfare. The invitation was unusual, since our interactions typically revolved around her need for favors rather than genuine desire for my company. But the timing felt providential, offering an opportunity to share my news in a neutral setting where public decorum might moderate her reaction. I agreed to meet her at 1 o'clock, then spent the morning researching the restaurant she'd chosen. It was exactly the kind of place Victoria loved, expensively decorated and strategically located to be seen by people whose opinions mattered to her social aspiration. The menu featured dishes that prioritized presentation over substance, the kind of food designed to photograph well for social media rather than challenge culinary boundaries. Victoria was already seated when I arrived, occupying a corner table that offered prime people-watching opportunities while ensuring privacy for our conversation. She looked impeccable as always, her professional wardrobe and salon-perfect hair suggesting someone whose appearance was carefully managed to project success and to sophistication. "You look tired," she said by way of greeting, though her tone carried concern rather than criticism. "Are you working too many shifts at that place? I keep telling you that you're burning yourself out for a job that doesn't appreciate your intelligence." I ordered a salad I couldn't afford and coffee I didn't need, buying time while I considered how to navigate a conversation that would fundamentally alter our relationship dynamic. Victoria had always positioned herself as the wise older sister offering guidance to someone whose choices were inherently misguided. And today I would be challenging that narrative directly. "Actually, I have some news about work," I said, watching her expression carefully. "I've been offered a position as sous chef at a new restaurant opening in a few weeks. It's a significant advancement, both professionally and financially." Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth and I saw her processing this information with the calculated precision she brought to legal negotiation. She was trying to determine whether this development supported or threatened her worldview about my career choices, whether it represented genuine success, or simply another variation of the instability she'd always predicted. "That's wonderful, Zez," she said, finally, though her enthusiasm felt manufactured. "Which restaurant? And how much of a salary increase are we talking about?" I explained about Chef Rousseau, his reputation in the culinary world, the significance of working in a kitchen that would undoubtedly earn critical acclaim. I mentioned the substantial salary increase, though I kept the specific numbers private because Victoria's competitive nature would transform them into a comparison rather than a celebration. "So this is a real restaurant," she said, and I could hear her recalibrating her assessment of my career prospects. "Not just another casual dining place where you work yourself to death for minimum wage." The comment stung because it revealed how little she understood about the restaurants where I'd been building my skills, places that might not have earned Michelin stars but employed talented cooks who took pride in their work. Her dismissal of casual dining reflected the same class consciousness that made her value Nathan's corporate success over my culinary ambitions. "All restaurants are real, Victoria. The difference is the level of complexity and the expectations placed on the staff. I've been working in kitchens that taught me fundamentals, and now I'm ready for a kitchen that will challenge me to grow." She nodded thoughtfully, sipping her wine while considering the implications of my news. I could almost see her mental gears turning as she adjusted her understanding of my life trajectory, accounting for the possibility that my unconventional choices might actually lead to conventional markers of success. "I'm proud of you," she said, and for a moment, her voice carried genuine warmth. "I've always worried that you were selling yourself short working in places that didn't recognize your potential. This sounds like an opportunity that actually matches your education and ability." The conversation continued pleasantly for another hour, covering safe topics like family updates and Portland's restaurant scene. Victoria asked intelligent questions about my new responsibilities, the restaurant's concept, and my long-term career goal. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely interested in my professional life, rather than simply tolerating it as evidence of my poor judgment. But as we prepared to leave, she said something that reminded me why I'd been avoiding deeper conversations about my career aspirations. "This is such great timing," she said, gathering her purse and jacket with practiced efficiency. "Nathan and I are hosting a dinner party next month for some of his colleagues, and it would be perfect to have a real chef prepare something impressive. You could use our kitchen, and I'd cover the ingredient costs. It would be great exposure for you, and everyone would be so impressed that I have a sister who works at a fancy restaurant." The request felt like ice water thrown on the warmth I'd been feeling about our conversation. Victoria had listened to my news, processed its significance, and immediately calculated how it could benefit her social standing. She saw my professional advancement not as something to celebrate for its own sake, but as a resource she could exploit for her own purposes. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I don't think mixing family and professional obligations is a good idea right now. I'll be learning a new job, adapting to different expectations, and I need to focus entirely on that transition." Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced smile becoming slightly more forced. She wasn't accustomed to being declined when she made requests that seemed reasonable on the surface, but carried undertones of exploitation. In her worldview, family members were supposed to support each other's endeavors, and my refusal probably felt like ingratitude rather than boundary setting. "Of course," she said, though her tone suggested this conversation wasn't finished. "Maybe once you're more settled in the new position. It's just such a waste not to share your talents with people who could appreciate them properly." I walked back to my apartment through the Pearl District, past galleries and boutiques and restaurants that catered to people like Victoria, individuals whose lives moved smoothly along predetermined tracks of education, career advancement, marriage, and social climbing. The neighborhood was beautiful, prosperous, filled with evidence of successful life choices and careful planning, but I found myself thinking about the kitchen at Le Jardin Noir, the intense focus that eliminated everything except the immediate demands of cooking at the highest level. There was something pure about that environment, where success was measured by the quality of work rather than the opinions of people who would never understand the craft involved. That evening I spent hours researching Chef Rousseau's background, reading interviews where he discussed his philosophy of cooking and management. He spoke frequently about the importance of creating a kitchen culture where people felt supported in taking risks, making mistakes, and growing beyond their current limitations. He believed that cooking was collaborative art that required both individual excellence and collective harmony. His approach to leadership seemed fundamentally different from the management styles I'd experienced in other restaurants, where hierarchy was enforced through intimidation rather than earned through competence. He talked about teaching rather than commanding, about creating an environment where people felt empowered to contribute their own ideas while respecting established standards. Reading his interviews also revealed the personal sacrifices that had shaped his career trajectory. He had moved to Portland from Lyon in his 20s, working in kitchens where his accent was mocked and his techniques were dismissed as pretentious. He had endured years of 14-hour days, financial uncertainty, and the constant pressure of proving himself in an industry that often valued bravado over genuine skill. But he had persisted because he believed that cooking was a form of artistic expression worthy of the same respect accorded to painting, music, or literature. He had built his reputation by consistently producing extraordinary food while mentoring young cooks who shared his commitment to excellence. His restaurants were known not just for their cuisine but for the number of alumni who had gone on to open successful establishments of their own. This was the tradition I was joining, a lineage of people who had chosen to pursue beauty and meaning through the daily act of feeding others. It was a tradition that valued craft over commerce, though it certainly didn't ignore the business realities that made artistic expression possible. It was a tradition that demanded physical endurance, emotional resilience, and the kind of dedication that made sense only to people who felt called to the work. Saturday morning brought my final shift at Midtown Grill, an 8-hour stretch that felt simultaneously like any other day, and like the end of an era. I worked my station with the same attention to detail I'd always maintained, but every task carried the weight of finality. This was the last time I would prep vegetables for simple salads, the last time I would grill proteins for straightforward entrees, the last time I would work in a kitchen where competence was sufficient rather than excellence being mandatory. My coworkers had organized a small celebration after service, gathering in the dining room to share drinks and reminisce about the past 3 years. Marcus presented me with a letter of recommendation that was generous in its praise, emphasizing my reliability, skill development, and positive influence on kitchen culture. Several of the other cooks expressed genuine sadness about my departure, acknowledging that my departure would create a gap that would be difficult to fill. "Don't forget about us when you're famous," joked Carlos, the prep cook who had taught me more about efficient knife work than any culinary school instructor, "and remember where you came from when you open your own place someday." The comment was meant to be lighthearted, but it carried an undertone of truth that resonated throughout the evening. Success in the restaurant industry was often accompanied by amnesia about the people and places that had provided foundation for advancement. I had seen successful chefs dismiss their early experiences as somehow beneath their current status, forgetting that every kitchen teaches valuable lessons about resilience, teamwork, and the fundamental importance of treating food with respect. I made silent promises to remember this kitchen, these people, the lessons I'd learned about persistence and humility during my years of working for hourly wages while dreaming of something great. Success would be meaningless if it came at the cost of forgetting where I'd developed the skills that made advancement possible. Sunday was spent in quiet preparation for the week ahead, the calm before what would certainly be an intense period of adjustment. I sharpened my knives with the ritual precision that had become meditation, ensuring that every blade was perfectly honed for the demands of working at Le Jardin Noir. I organized my uniforms, polishing shoes and pressing chef's coats, until everything met the visual standards expected in a kitchen where appearance reflected professional seriousness. But mostly I thought about the conversation I needed to have with Victoria about boundaries, respect, and the difference between supporting family and enabling manipulation. The success of my audition had given me confidence to address patterns that had shaped our relationship for decades, but it had also clarified what was at stake if I continued accepting her casual dismissal of my dreams and ambition. The dinner party request had crystallized something important about how Victoria viewed our relationship. She was happy to celebrate my success as long as it could be converted into social capital for her own benefit. She was willing to acknowledge my talents provided they remained available for her exploitation. She could accept that I was a real chef as long as that identity served her purposes, rather than challenging her assumptions about appropriate life choices. This was the dynamic I needed to change, not through dramatic confrontation but through consistent enforcement of boundaries that protected my professional development and personal well-being. I needed to establish that my time, skills, and energy were not automatically available for her convenience, that my career advancement meant increased responsibility rather than increased availability for family obligations. The conversation would be difficult because it would force Victoria to confront her own patterns of behavior, to acknowledge that her assumptions about our relationship were no longer accurate. But it was also necessary because my new position would demand focus and commitment that would be impossible if I continued allowing family obligations to supersede professional responsibility. As evening approached, I found myself standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the Portland skyline that would soon become the backdrop for a completely different chapter of my life. In less than 48 hours, I would walk into Le Jardin Noir as a sous chef, carrying responsibilities that would challenge everything I thought I knew about cooking profession. But first, I needed to call my sister and begin the process of redefining our relationship to reflect who I was becoming rather than who I had been. The conversation would set the tone for everything that followed, establishing whether my professional advancement would be supported or undermined by the people who claimed to love me most. I picked up my phone, scrolled to Victoria's contact, and prepared to have the most important conversation of our adult relationship. The phone rang 3 times before Victoria answered, her voice carrying the distracted tone of someone managing multiple priorities simultaneously. I could hear Nathan's television in the background, some sports commentary mixing with the sounds of their evening routine in the West Hills mansion that had become their retreat from the complexities of ordinary life. "Zara, perfect timing," she said before I could speak. "I was just thinking about you. Nathan's partners are coming for dinner next Friday and I've been planning the most incredible menu. Since you're going to be working at that fancy restaurant now, I thought you could prepare something really impressive. I'm thinking 7 courses, maybe 8 if you have time to do proper amuse-bouches." The presumption in her voice hit me like cold water. She hadn't asked if I was available, hadn't inquired about my schedule or responsibilities, hadn't even considered that my new position might involve working Friday evening. She had simply assumed that my professional advancement existed primarily to serve her social ambitions, that becoming a sous chef at Le Jardin Noir meant I now possessed skills she could showcase for her benefit. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about something important," I said, cutting through her detailed description of the evening she'd been planning, "about our conversation at lunch and what you asked me to do." The silence that followed carried weight, the kind of pause that preceded conversations neither party really wanted to have. I could almost hear Victoria recalibrating, recognizing that my tone suggested this wasn't going to be the enthusiastic acceptance she'd expected. "Oh," she said finally, her voice shifting from excitement to caution. "Is this about payment? Because I'm happy to compensate you properly. I know your time is valuable now that you're working somewhere more professional." The offer of compensation revealed how fundamentally she misunderstood what I was trying to communicate. She thought this was a negotiation about price rather than a conversation about boundaries, that my hesitation could be resolved through financial incentive, rather than recognition that her request was inappropriate. "This isn't about money, Victoria. This is about the pattern I've been enabling for years, where you treat my time and skills as resources you can access whenever it's convenient for you. The dinner party request is just the latest example of something that's been happening since we were children." I could hear her breathing change, becoming more measured as she processed what I was saying. Victoria was intelligent enough to understand criticism when it was presented clearly, but she was also skilled at deflecting uncomfortable truths through emotional manipulation that had worked effectively throughout our relationship. "I don't understand," she said, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly well. "I've always been supportive of your cooking. I brag about you to my friends all the time. I'm constantly telling people how talented you are, how proud I am of your accomplishments. You're proud of my accomplishments when they reflect well on you," I said, feeling years of suppressed frustration crystallizing into clarity. "But you've never been supportive of my career when it inconvenienced you. 3 weeks ago, you dismissed my dreams as a little chef fantasy while demanding I babysit during the most important competition of my professional life." The mention of the babysitting incident seemed to catch her off guard, probably because she'd assumed I had forgotten about her casual cruelty in the excitement of my recent success. But I remembered every word she'd said about my career being unimportant compared to her anniversary dinner, every assumption she'd made about my priorities being automatically subordinate to hers. "That was different," she said, her voice taking on the defensive edge that appeared whenever her behavior was questioned directly. I was desperate, and I needed someone I could trust with the kids. You didn't seem to have any other plans that night, and I had no idea this job opportunity would come from missing one little cooking contest. The phrase "one little cooking contest" revealed everything about how Victoria viewed my professional life. She had absorbed none of what I'd told her about the competition's significance, had retained no understanding of what that opportunity had meant to me. In her mind, my career existed in a separate category from real work, something that could be postponed or rearranged without serious consequences. It wasn't a little cooking contest, Victoria. It was a scholarship competition that could have launched my career months early. I missed it because you convinced me that my dreams were less important than your convenience, and then you spent the entire phone call insulting my life choices while making it clear that disappointing you would be a moral failure. I never said your dreams weren't important, she protested, though we both knew this was revisionist history. I just said that family comes first, which I still believe. We're supposed to support each other, and that means making sacrifices when someone you love needs help. The word sacrifices hung in the air between us, loaded with all the resentment I'd been swallowing for years. Victoria's definition of family support was remarkably one-sided, requiring me to sacrifice my time, energy, and opportunities, while she sacrificed nothing more substantial than the inconvenience of finding alternative solutions to her problem. When was the last time you made a sacrifice for my career? I asked, letting the question settle before continuing. When have you ever rearranged your schedule to support something that mattered to me? When have you treated my professional obligations with the same respect you demand for yours? The silence stretched long enough for me to hear Nathan calling something to Victoria from another room, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone whose priorities were never questioned by family members. Eventually Victoria spoke again, her tone shifting toward the wounded confusion she'd perfected during childhood arguments. I can't believe you're attacking me like this, she said. All I wanted was to share your success with people who could appreciate it. I thought you'd be flattered that I wanted to show off your talents to Nathan's colleagues. These are successful people who could become valuable connections for your career. This response crystallized everything wrong with Victoria's understanding of professional relationships. She genuinely believed that cooking for her husband's law firm partners would constitute career advancement for me, that exposure to wealthy professionals would somehow translate into opportunities in the culinary world. She couldn't comprehend that networking in restaurants required completely different strategies than networking in corporate environments. Victoria, Nathan's colleagues are not potential customers for fine dining restaurants. They're not food writers, restaurant investors, or people who influence Portland's culinary scene. Cooking for them would be providing catering services for your social advancement, not building my professional reputation. But they have money, she said, as if this settled the matter entirely. They eat at expensive restaurants all the time. Some of them probably know restaurant owners or investors or whatever. You never know what connections might develop from an evening like that. Her logic revealed the fundamental disconnect between how she understood career development in her field versus mine. Legal advancement often did depend on social connections, on being visible to the right people at the right moments, on demonstrating competence in settings that blended professional and personal interaction. But culinary careers were built differently, through kitchen experience, critical recognition, and respect from peers who understood the craft involved. I understand you think you're helping, I said, trying to find language that would penetrate her defensive reason. But what you're really asking is for me to work for free to impress your friends so they'll think better of you for having a chef in the family. That's not career advancement for me, that's exploitation disguised as opportunity. The word exploitation seemed to shock her into actual silence, probably because it named something she'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. Victoria's requests always came wrapped in language about family support, mutual benefit, and shared success, but stripped of that packaging, they revealed a pattern of using my skills and availability for her convenience while offering nothing of value in return. That's an incredibly hurtful thing to say, she finally responded, her voice carrying genuine pain that made me question whether I was being too harsh. I've always been proud of you, always encouraged your cooking, always supported your dreams even when mom and dad had doubts. This was Victoria's most effective manipulation technique, reframing criticism of her behavior as attacks on her character while simultaneously claiming credit for support she'd never actually provided. She had not encouraged my cooking when it required her sacrifice, had not supported my dreams when they conflicted with her needs, and had certainly not defended me when our parents expressed doubts about my career choices. "You've been proud of me when it was easy," I said, maintaining my focus despite her emotional deflection. "But you've never supported me when it cost you anything. The only reason you're interested in my success now is because you think it can benefit you socially." "That's not true," she said, though her protest lacked conviction. "I want you to be successful because I love you and want you to be happy. The dinner party was just an idea, a way to celebrate your achievement while introducing you to people who might appreciate your talent." I found myself staring out my apartment window at the Portland skyline, watching traffic lights change in patterns that suddenly seemed more predictable than my family relationship. Victoria was trapped in a worldview where her motivations were always pure, her requests always reasonable, and any resistance to her plans always evidence of ingratitude or misunderstanding. "Victoria, I need you to understand something important," I said, feeling the weight of words that would fundamentally alter our relationship. "I'm not going to be available for family favors the way I have been in the past. My new job requires complete focus and commitment, and I can't allow family obligations to interfere with my professional responsibilities." The sharpness of her intake of breath told me she understood the implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about declining the dinner party request. This was about establishing boundaries that would prevent future manipulation, creating space for my career to develop, without constant interference from family members who viewed my success as their resource. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "That family doesn't matter to you anymore. That your job is more important than the people who love you." The question was designed to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my professional development, but instead it clarified the choice Victoria was forcing me to make. She was demanding that I continue subordinating my career to her convenience, while framing this demand as evidence of love and family loyalty. "I'm saying that loving someone doesn't mean being available for exploitation," I replied. "I'm saying that family support should be mutual rather than one-sided. I'm saying that I'm not going to sacrifice my professional advancement for your social climbing anymore." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, circling through variations of the same arguments as Victoria tried different approaches to convince me that her request was reasonable and my boundaries were selfish. She appealed to family tradition, reminded me of favors she'd done for me years ago, and suggested that my success had made me arrogant and ungrateful. But something fundamental had shifted in my ability to resist her manipulation. The validation I'd received from Chef, the respect I'd earned through years of dedicated work, the confidence that came from finally achieving recognition for my skills, all of this had created a foundation of self-worth that couldn't be undermined by family members who had never understood or supported my ambition. "I hope you'll reconsider," Victoria said finally, her tone suggesting that this conversation was a temporary setback rather than a permanent change in our relationship dynamic. "I think you're making a mistake that you'll regret when you realize how important family connections are for long-term success." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment processing what had just happened. The conversation had been more difficult than I'd anticipated, but also more liberating. For the first time in our adult relationship, I had articulated boundaries clearly and maintained them despite Victoria's emotional manipulation. I had refused to allow guilt or family obligation to override my professional judgment. But I also knew that this was just the beginning of a longer process of redefining our relationship. Victoria would not easily accept that her access to my time and skills was no longer unlimited, that my career advancement meant decreased availability for her convenience. She would probably continue testing these boundaries, finding new ways to frame her requests as family obligations that couldn't be reasonably refused. The next morning brought my first day at Le Jardin Noir, and I arrived early enough to witness the kitchen's transformation from quiet prep space to orchestrated chaos. Marie greeted me with the professional warmth that characterized the restaurant's culture, introducing me to the morning crew and explaining the prep schedule that would occupy the first several hours of my shift. "Your station is there," she said, indicating a section of the line that looked both familiar and intimidating. Today you'll be working with James on meat preparation and learning our specific protocols for protein cookery. Everything here has been tested extensively, so follow procedures exactly until you understand why we do things the way we do. James turned out to be a serious young cook whose precision with knife work rivaled anything I'd seen during culinary school. He demonstrated techniques for fabricating proteins that were more sophisticated than the straightforward butchery I'd been doing at Midtown Grill, breaking down whole animals into cuts that were optimized for specific cooking methods and presentation requirements. Chef Rousseau believes that understanding ingredients completely is the foundation of cooking them properly. James explained as he showed me how to remove silver skin from tenderloin with surgical precision. We don't just cook proteins here, we study them, respect them, and transform them into something that honors both the ingredient and the diner's expectations. The philosophy behind every task at Le Jardin Noir was more complex than anything I'd encountered in previous kitchens. Vegetable preparation involved understanding optimal storage conditions, peak ripeness indicators, and cooking methods that would preserve nutritional value while developing maximum flavor. Sauce work required knowledge of emulsification science, reduction ratios, and seasoning adjustments that would accommodate variations in ingredient quality. During my lunch break, I called Camille to share details about my first morning and the conversation I'd had with Victoria the previous evening. Her response was immediate and supportive, the kind of validation I needed to confirm that establishing boundaries had been necessary rather than selfish. "I'm proud of you for finally calling her out," Camille said. "Victoria has been manipulating you for years, and you've been enabling it because you're a good person who wants to believe that family members have your best interests at heart. But some people will exploit kindness indefinitely unless they're forced to confront their behavior." We talked about the challenges of working in a kitchen where excellence was mandatory rather than aspirational, the pressure of learning new systems, while proving that I deserved the opportunity I'd been given. Camille had experience with similar transitions, and offered practical advice about managing stress while maintaining the focus necessary for professional growth. "The first few weeks will be overwhelming," she said. "You're going to feel like you don't know anything, like everyone else is operating at a level you'll never reach. But you earned this position because Chef Rousseau recognized your potential. Trust his judgment even when you're doubting yourself." The afternoon passed in intensive training on sauce techniques that were far more complex than anything I'd attempted previous. The kitchen sauce station was managed by an older cook named Philippe, who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants throughout Europe before joining Chef Rousseau's team. His knowledge of classical French technique was encyclopedic, but he also understood modern applications that honored tradition while accommodating contemporary taste. "Every sauce tells a story," Philippe explained as he demonstrated reduction techniques that concentrated flavors without creating heaviness. "It must complement the protein without overwhelming it, enhance the vegetables without masking them, and tie together all the elements of the dish in a way that makes sense to both the palate and the mind." I spent hours practicing mother sauces and their derivatives, learning to recognize the precise moment when reduction achieved optimal concentration, understanding how acid, fat, and seasoning could be balanced to create harmony rather than conflict. The precision required was unlike anything I'd experienced, demanding attention to details that would have seemed excessive in more casual dining environments. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. My brain felt overstimulated from processing new information constantly, my muscles ached from maintaining the perfect posture required for fine knife work, and my palate was overwhelmed from tasting dozens of subtle variations in seasoning and technique. But I was also exhilarated by the complexity of what I was learning, the sophistication of techniques I'd only read about in cookbooks, the collaborative energy of working with people who shared my commitment to excellence. This was the kitchen environment I'd been dreaming about for years, where every task was performed with intention and every detail contributed to experiences that would justify diners' investment of time and money. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Victoria that seemed designed to test whether our previous conversation had created lasting change in our relationship dynamic. "Emergency babysitting needed tomorrow night. Sitter cancelled and Nathan has client dinner. Can you help?" The request was classic Victoria, framed as an emergency that required immediate assistance while ignoring everything I'd said about boundaries and professional commitment. She was testing whether I would maintain the limits I'd established, or revert to familiar patterns of accommodation when presented with apparent crisis. I responded with a simple message that acknowledged her situation without accepting responsibility for solving it. Sorry, I'm work. Hope you find someone reliable. Text took me several minutes to compose because every word felt loaded with implications about the kind of relationship we would have going forward. Her response came within minutes. Working? I thought restaurants were closed on Tuesday. The follow-up revealed that Victoria had never bothered to learn basic facts about my work schedule despite years of conversation about restaurant industry standards. She had assumed that my new position would operate according to conventional business hours, that becoming a sous chef meant working Monday through Friday like a corporate professional. We prep and train on closed days. Professional kitchens operate differently than offices, I replied, maintaining the educational tone without defensiveness or lengthy explanation. The text conversation ended there, but I knew Victoria was processing this interaction as evidence that I had changed in ways she didn't fully understand. Her requests would probably become more sophisticated as she learned to work around my boundaries, but for now, I had successfully maintained the limits I'd established without guilt or extensive justification. Wednesday brought news that would test these boundaries in ways I hadn't anticipated. Chef Rousseau called me into his office after the morning prep session, his expression serious enough to make me wonder if I'd made some mistake during my first 2 days that warranted immediate correction. I've been invited to cook at the James Beard House next month, he said, settling behind his desk with the focused attention he brought to all important conversations. It's a significant honor, and I'd like you to be part of the team I bring to New York. The experience would be invaluable for your development, but it would require taking several days off from regular service here. The James Beard House represented the pinnacle of culinary achievement in America, a venue where only the most respected chefs were invited to showcase their techniques for audiences of food writers, restaurateurs, and culinary professionals. Being selected for Chef Rousseau's team would provide exposure and networking opportunities that could shape the entire trajectory of my career. The travel and accommodation would be covered by the foundation, he continued, and this would be paid time, not a personal expense. But I want you to consider whether you're ready for that level of visibility so early in your tenure here. I accepted immediately, understanding that opportunities like this might not come again for years. But as we discussed logistics and menu planning, I realized that this trip would coincide with Leo's birthday party, an event that Victoria had been planning for months and had mentioned repeatedly during our recent conversation. The party wasn't just a family gathering but an elaborate celebration involving extended relatives, family friends, and children from Leo's school. Victoria had been coordinating catering, entertainment, and decorations with the precision she brought to all social events, and she had mentioned several times that she was counting on my attendance to help manage logistics. This would be the ultimate test of the boundaries I'd established, a direct conflict between family obligation and professional opportunity that would force me to choose definitively between Victoria's expectations and my career advancement. There would be no compromise solution, no way to satisfy both commitments without sacrificing the quality of my performance in one or both contexts. I drove home that evening knowing that the conversation with Victoria about the James Beard House would be far more difficult than our discussion about the dinner party. Missing a nephew's birthday party to cook in New York would confirm every criticism she'd ever made about my priorities, every accusation that my career mattered more to me than family relationships. But I also knew that declining Chef Rousseau's invitation would be professional suicide, a signal that I wasn't serious about advancement in an industry where opportunities were rare and second chances were even rarer. The James Beard House invitation was recognition that I belonged among the most talented young cooks in the country, validation that my skills had reached a level worthy of national attention. As I parked outside my apartment building, I realized that this conflict represented more than a scheduling problem. It was the definitive moment when I would have to choose between the life Victoria wanted me to live and the life I had worked years to create. There would be no going back from whatever decision I made, no way to repair relationships that couldn't survive my commitment to professional excellence. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching Portland's evening light fade into the kind of twilight that made difficult decisions feel both inevitable and terrifying. Tomorrow, I would call Victoria and explain about the James Beard House, and she would respond with emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for choosing career over family. But for the first time in our relationship, I felt confident that guilt would not determine my choice. The respect I had earned from Chef Rousseau, the validation that came from working in a kitchen where my skills were valued, the knowledge that I possessed talents worth developing. All of this had created a foundation that couldn't be undermined by family members who had never understood or supported my ambitions. The conversation would be painful, but the choice was already made. The call to Victoria came Thursday evening, after a shift that had pushed my skills and endurance to new limits. I had spent 10 hours learning sauce techniques that required precision measured in seconds, practicing knife cuts that demanded perfection rather than mere competence, absorbing feedback from chefs whose standards were higher than anything I'd encountered in my culinary education. My hands were stained with beets and my arms ached from holding perfect posture over cutting boards, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. Working at Le Jardin Noir was clarifying in ways I hadn't expected, stripping away doubts about my capabilities while confirming that I belonged in kitchens where excellence was the baseline rather than the aspiration. Victoria answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the cheerful energy that always preceded requests for assistance. She launched immediately into details about Leo's birthday party preparations, the elaborate plan she'd been coordinating for weeks to ensure that her 8-year-old son would have a celebration worthy of the Delacroix family's social standard. The caterer confirmed they can handle the main courses, but I'm still worried about dessert presentation, she said, apparently unaware that I hadn't called to discuss party logistics. You have such an artistic eye for plating, and I thought maybe you could create something special for Leo. He's been talking about you constantly since you started working at that fancy restaurant. The casual assumption that I would contribute labor to her event stung, particularly coming so soon after our conversation about boundaries and mutual respect. Victoria had absorbed none of what I'd tried to communicate about treating my skills as resources she could access automatically, and she was already reverting to familiar patterns of expectation and manipulation. Victoria, I need to tell you something important about that weekend, I said, cutting through her detailed description of party themes and guest lists. I've been invited to cook at the James Beard House in New York. It's the same weekend as Leo's party, and I won't be able to attend. The silence that followed was complete, the kind of vacuum that preceded either understanding or explosion. I could hear the television in Victoria's background, some sitcom where conflicts were resolved through witty dialogue and warm family moments, while we navigated the kind of real-world tension that didn't accommodate easy solutions. The James Beard House, she repeated finally, her voice flat with the effort of processing information that contradicted her expectations. That's the cooking thing in New York that you've mentioned before. It's not just a cooking thing, Victoria. It's the most prestigious venue for American chefs, an invitation that represents recognition at the highest level of the culinary profession. Being selected for Chef Rousseau's team is an honor that could change the entire trajectory of my career. I explained the significance of the invitation, the rarity of such opportunities, the professional suicide that would result from declining participation in favor of a family birthday party. But even as I spoke, I could hear Victoria's breathing change in ways that signaled emotional preparation for the kind of confrontation that had shaped our relationship since childhood. So you're choosing work over family, she said, her voice taking on the wounded tone that had always made disagreement feel like betrayal. You're abandoning your nephew's birthday party, something he's been looking forward to for months, because you think cooking for strangers in New York is more important than being present for people who actually love you. The accusation hit exactly the pressure points Victoria had been targeting for decades, suggesting that prioritizing my professional development was evidence of moral failure rather than career advancement. She had perfected the art of making my ambitions feel selfish, my dreams feel like betrayals of family loyalty and obligation. I'm choosing a once-in-a-lifetime professional opportunity over a birthday party, I said, maintaining focus despite the familiar guilt that always accompanied Victoria's emotional manipulation. Leo will have many more birthdays, but I may never get another invitation to cook at the James Beard House. Listen to yourself, Victoria said, her voice rising with genuine anger. You're talking about an 8-year-old child like he's replaceable, like his feelings don't matter compared to your career ambitions. This is exactly what I've been worried about since you started taking this cooking thing so serious. You're losing perspective about what's actually important in life. The phrase cooking thing revealed everything about how Victoria viewed my profession, despite the recent success that should have forced her to reconsider her dismissive attitude. In her mind, my work remained a hobby that had gotten out of hand rather than a legitimate career worthy of the same respect she demanded for her legal practice. What's important in life is pursuing work that gives meaning and purpose, I replied, feeling years of suppressed frustration crystallizing into clarity. What's important is refusing to sacrifice professional advancement for people who have never supported my dreams except when it was convenient for them. I've always supported your dreams, Victoria protested, though we both knew this was revisionist history designed to deflect criticism of her behavior. I've encouraged your cooking, praised your talents, defended your choices when other family members had doubted. The only thing I've ever asked is that you remember family obligations come first. This response encapsulated everything wrong with Victoria's understanding of support and obligation. She had offered encouragement when it cost her nothing, but had never defended my choices when doing so required sacrifice on her part. Her definition of family obligation was remarkably one-sided, requiring me to prioritize her needs, while she prioritized her own. You've supported my dreams when they didn't interfere with your plans, I said, but every time my career has conflicted with your convenience, you've found ways to make me feel guilty for having ambitions that didn't revolve around your family's needs. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, cycling through variations of arguments we'd been having for years. Victoria appealed to family tradition, reminded me of childhood memories when we'd been close, suggested that success had made me cold and ungrateful. She deployed every emotional weapon she'd developed over decades of getting her way through manipulation rather than persuasion. But something fundamental had changed in my ability to resist her influence. The validation I'd received from Chef Rousseau, the respect I'd earned from colleagues who understood my craft, the knowledge that I possessed skills worthy of national recognition. All of this had created a foundation of self-worth that couldn't be undermined by family members who had never understood or valued my professional development. I hope you'll reconsider, Victoria said finally, her tone suggesting that this was a temporary disagreement rather than a permanent shift in our relationship dynamic. I hope you'll remember that Leo loves you and that missing his party will hurt him in ways that might take years to repair. The final manipulation was expertly deployed, using my nephew's feelings as leverage to guilt me into sacrificing my career advancement for her convenience. But I recognized the technique now, understood how Victoria had been using my love for Leo and Mia to ensure my compliance with her expectations throughout their childhood. Leo will understand when he's older that his aunt chose to pursue excellence in her profession, I said. And if you explain the situation properly, he'll be proud that someone he loves was selected for such an honor. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment kitchen surrounded by the tools and books that defined my chosen profession. Tomorrow would bring another intense day of learning at Le Jardin Noir. More techniques to master and standards to meet under the guidance of chefs who had built their reputations through uncompromising pursuit of excellence. But tonight I felt the particular satisfaction that came from finally choosing my own path over other people's expectations. The conversation with Victoria had been painful, but it had also been liberating in ways I was only beginning to understand. For the first time in our adult relationship, I had refused to allow guilt or family obligation to override my professional judgment. 3 weeks later, I stood in the legendary kitchen of the James Beard House, wearing the crisp whites that identified me as part of Chef Rousseau's team. The kitchen buzzed with controlled energy as we prepared to serve a tasting menu that would showcase techniques developed over months of collaboration and refinement. The other team members were accomplished cooks whose credentials intimidated and inspired me. They moved with the confidence that came from years of working in kitchens where precision was mandatory and creativity was encouraged within clearly defined parameters. Being included in this group represented validation that my skills had reached a level worthy of national attention. Tonight we tell the story of Pacific Northwest cuisine, Chef Rousseau said as we completed final preparations. Every dish must honor ingredients, technique, and the collaborative spirit that makes exceptional dining possible. You've earned the right to be here through years of dedicated work. Now show our guests why Portland's culinary scene deserves international recognition. The service unfolded with the rhythm I'd been learning at Le Jardin Noir, each course building upon the previous to create a narrative that connected diners to place, season, and tradition. I worked the protein station with the precision that had become second nature, turning out perfectly cooked dishes while coordinating with teammates whose movements had become familiar through weeks of practice. The dining room was filled with food writers, restaurateurs, and culinary professionals whose opinions could influence careers and shape reputation. These were people who understood the craft involved in creating memorable dining experiences, who appreciated subtle technique and innovative applications of classical methods. During a brief break between courses, I allowed myself to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, I had been working at Midtown Grill, dreaming about opportunities that seemed impossibly distant. Tonight, I was cooking in the most prestigious venue in American cuisine, contributing to an experience that would be reviewed in national publications and remembered by diners who had eaten in the world's best restaurant. The evening concluded with applause that felt different from anything I'd experienced in casual dining establishments. This was recognition from peers who understood the complexity of what we'd accomplished, appreciation from an audience whose expectations were educated by exposure to exceptional cuisine. Later, as we cleaned the kitchen with the same attention to detail we'd brought to food preparation, Chef Rousseau pulled me aside for a conversation that would shape the next phase of my career development. "Your performance tonight was exceptional," he said, his voice carrying the authority that made praise from him particularly meaningful. "You've demonstrated readiness for increased responsibility. I'd like you to begin developing your own dishes for our spring menu, working directly with me on concept development and execution." The opportunity represented everything I'd been working towards since entering culinary school. A chance to contribute creative input while continuing to learn from one of the most innovative chefs in the Pacific Northwest. It was recognition that I had evolved from someone who simply executed other people's recipes to a cook capable of developing original concepts worthy of Le Jardinois' reputation. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my own restaurant, a small neighborhood establishment that specialized in the kind of sophisticated comfort food that had emerged from my training under Chef Rousseau. The space was intimate, seating only 30 guests, but every detail reflected the standards I'd absorbed during my time at Le Jardinois. The opening had been covered in Portland's food media, with reviews that praised technical execution, while noting the emotional resonance of dishes that honored tradition while embracing innovation. The restaurant was booked solid for its first month, with waiting lists that suggested sustainable success rather than momentary curiosity. Camille had joined me as sous chef, bringing her own expertise while helping to establish the collaborative culture that would define our kitchen. Together, we were building something that reflected our shared values about hospitality, craftsmanship, and the transformative power of exceptional food. "Order up," I called, sliding plates across the pass with the timing that had become automatic through years of practice. Each dish represented techniques I'd learned from chefs who had generously shared their knowledge, combined with innovations that emerged from my own understanding of flavor, texture, and presentation. The dining room was filled with guests who had chosen to spend their evening with us, trusting that we would create experiences worthy of their time and investment. Some were food enthusiasts who appreciated technical complexity, others were neighborhood regulars who simply wanted well-prepared meals in comfortable surroundings. During a brief lull in service, my phone buzzed with a text from Leo, now 9 years old and learning to navigate family dynamics that had grown more complex since his birthday party. "Aunt Zara, Mom showed me the magazine article about your restaurant. I'm really proud of it. Can I come visit the kitchen sometime?" The message carried forgiveness that I probably didn't deserve, understanding that seemed remarkable from someone so young. Leo had absorbed the adult conflicts surrounding him and chosen to maintain relationships that mattered to him, regardless of the tensions that had shaped decisions made in his name. Victoria and I had reached a détente that resembled respect more than warmth, a careful distance that acknowledged fundamental differences in our values and priorities. She attended the restaurant's opening with Nathan and the children, offering congratulations that seemed genuinely proud despite our ongoing disagreements about family obligation and professional ambition. "You've built something beautiful," she said as the evening wound down, gesturing toward the dining room where guests lingered over final courses and conversation. "I may not understand your choices, but I can see why they matter to you." The admission represented growth that I hadn't expected from someone whose worldview had seemed so rigid. Victoria was learning to separate her personal preferences from professional recognition, acknowledging that success could take forms she wouldn't choose for herself but could still appreciate when achieved by someone she loved. As the last guest departed and my team completed closing procedures, I found myself standing in the kitchen that represented the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since deciding to pursue cooking professionally. The space was quiet now, cleaned and organized for tomorrow's service, but it still held the energy of another successful evening. I thought about grandmother Celeste and the lessons she'd taught me about cooking as an expression of love, about food as a bridge between cultures and generations. Her recipes had provided the foundation for my understanding of flavor and technique, but her belief in the sacred nature of feeding people had shaped my approach to hospitality and service. The small silver chain she'd given me still hung around my neck, a reminder that success was meaningful only when it honored the people who had made it possible. Tonight, as every night, I had cooked for strangers who had trusted me to nourish them, creating experiences that connected them to ingredients, traditions, and each other. This was the life I had chosen over family expectations and social conventions, the path that had required sacrificing relationships that couldn't survive my commitment to professional excellence. It was a life built through years of physical exhaustion, financial uncertainty, and emotional isolation, but it was also a life that reflected my authentic self rather than other people's projections. The restaurant represented more than professional achievement. It was proof that dreams pursued with integrity and persistence could become reality despite obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Every plate that left our kitchen carried the accumulated wisdom of chefs who had shared their knowledge, techniques perfected through countless hours of practice, and innovations that emerged from understanding tradition well enough to transcend it. As I locked the front door and walked into Portland's late-night quiet, I realized that I had finally stopped seeking approval from people who would never understand my choices. The validation that mattered came from guests who returned week after week, from staff members who took pride in our collective achievements, from peers who recognized the quality of work we produced consistently. The city sparkled around me, filled with restaurants where talented cooks were finishing their own shifts, cleaning their own kitchens, and preparing for tomorrow's opportunity to create experiences that would nourish both body and spirit. We were part of an ecosystem that valued craft over commerce, though we certainly understood the business realities that made artistic expression possible. My phone buzzed with a message from Chef Rousseau, who had become both mentor and friend during my transition from line cook to restaurant owner. "Exceptional service tonight. Your grandmother would be proud of what you've built." The comment brought tears I hadn't expected, recognition that the journey from Victoria's dismissive comments about my chef fantasy to this moment of professional fulfillment had been worth every sacrifice it required. Grandmother Celeste's belief in the sacred nature of cooking had sustained me through years of doubt and struggle, guiding decisions that prioritized authenticity over approval. Tomorrow would bring another day of serving guests who trusted us to exceed their expectations, another opportunity to demonstrate that food prepared with skill and intention could transcend mere sustenance to become something approaching art. The work would be demanding, as it always was, but it would also be meaningful in ways that made the physical exhaustion feel worthwhile. I walked through the Pearl District toward my apartment, past other restaurants and bars where Portland's night economy continued to pulse with energy and possibility. The city had embraced my dreams when my family couldn't, providing opportunities to learn and grow, while building relationships based on shared values rather than biological obligation. The choice I'd made to prioritize professional development over family expectations had cost me the comfort of unconditional acceptance, but it had gained me something more valuable: the knowledge that I was living authentically, pursuing work that reflected my deepest values and capability. As I reached my building, I paused to look back at the neighborhood that had nurtured my ambitions, the community of chefs and restaurateurs who had welcomed me into their ranks, despite my lack of connections or family support in the industry. This was the family I had chosen, built through shared commitment to excellence rather than accidents of birth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.